Do you know that of all the most reputable mountain ranges in the world, the K2 seems to be the most infamous? Mountaineering is considered to be an extreme sport by a lot of people out there. For this set of people, it's an activity that can only be undertaken by the most daring. So every year, people with time and resources try to conquer some of the highest peaks on the planet, but unfortunately, most of them end up dead or gravely injured. Climbing mountains encompasses the delights produced by exploring one's courage, resourcefulness, cunning, strength, ability, and stamina to the utmost and not withheld even with the inherent risk. For most climbers, the pleasures of mountaineering lie not only in the conquest of a peak, but also in the physical and spiritual satisfactions brought about through intense personal effort, ever-increasing proficiency, and contact with natural grandeur. In today's video, we're going to give you an overview of the K2 mountain disaster, which claimed the lives of 7 victims, so stay tuned. The 1995 K2 disaster happened in the summer of 1995. Several expedition teams were preparing for their summit bids. They had gained a permit to climb the 8,611 meter, or 28,251 feet K2. On August 13, 1995, the remnants of the U.S. team and Alison Hargreaves joined forces with the New Zealand and Canadian team at Camp 4, around 7,600 meters or 24,900 feet above sea level, and at least 12 hours from the summit. Having joined a Spanish team of mountaineers above Camp 4, New Zealander Peter Hillary, son of Everest pioneer Sir Edmund Hillary, decided to turn back, noting that the weather that had been fine for the previous 4 days appeared to be changing. At exactly 6:45 p.m., in fine conditions, Hargreaves and Spaniard Javier Olivar reached the summit, followed by American Rob Slater, Spaniards Javier Escartin and Lorenzo Ortiz, and New Zealander Bruce Grant. Unfortunately, while returning from the summit, all 6 died in a violent storm. The 7th victim was the Canadian Jeff Lakes, who had turned back below the summit earlier. Although he managed to reach one of the lower camps due to the efforts of the exposure, he died as well. The next day, 2 Spanish climbers, Pepe Garces and another Lorenzo Ortiz, who had survived the storm at Camp 4, were descending the mountain suffering from frostbite and exhaustion. And while descending, just before they got to Camp 3, they found a blood-stained anorak, a climbing boot, and a harness. Immediately, they recognized the equipment as belonging to Hargreaves. And from Camp 3, they could also see a body in the distance. Although they didn't approach the body, hence it was not positively identified, but they had little doubt it was Hargreaves and concluded she had been blown off the mountain during the storm. Lorenzo Ortiz and Pepe Garces survived, but had to be airlifted out, enduring 6 days without a tent. Nobody can give detailed information on how the victims died. Their deaths are likely from the way the weather conditions were described, and very high winds played a part in the death of the victims. This is because the storm had reached nearby Broad Peak, which at 8,047 meters was 500 meters lower than K2 that day. Climbers on this mountain were already descending. They looked in horror across the valley and could see figures on K2 still going up. Out of 7, 6 climbers had already reached the summit of K2 at 6 p.m. prompt, while the other victim, Allison, had arrived there at exactly 6:17. And because the weather was still fine, they had no inkling of the devastation heading their way. By the time they turned to descend, the storm reached them. This implies that they couldn't go very far before the storm reached them. And with no fixed ropes to attach themselves to and nowhere to take shelter, they didn't stand a chance. They were blown off the mountain, picked up one by one, and flung down the south face. Among them were 3 Spaniards, who were Javier Escartin, Javier Olivar, and Lorenzo Ortiz, New Zealander Bruce Grant, American Rob Slater, and Alison Hargreaves. 2 days later, a 7th climber, Canadian Jeff Lakes, died of exhaustion at Camp 2 after fighting his way down through the storm. Unaware of the incident, the teammates of the 3 Spanish climbers waited earnestly for them in Camp 4, all through the 14th of August until it became clear that their friends would not be returning. With that knowledge and fear, they decided to descend. It was when they got somewhere on the slope beneath Camp 4, thousands of meters below the summit of K2, that they came upon a boot which they knew belonged to Alison Hargreaves. And as if to confirm their fears, When they looked across, they saw a body clad in their distinctive green clothing. The body was lying in an inaccessible location 300 meters away. They were exhausted, but knew there was no way they could retrieve it. They continued down, leaving Britain's greatest female mountaineer where she lay. The same thing applies to the other victims. Their bodies were all left there. Some media sites blamed the climbers for their deaths. The reason was that the victims decided to keep climbing when others on the mountain had turned around. Again, by the time they had left for their summit push on the 9th of August, and when they reached Camp 3, they had discovered that it had been buried by an avalanche but still proceeded to descend. On most mountains, such an event can only happen as a result of a bad decision, which is to camp in an avalanche path. But unlike the K2, there are no safe places to camp. Avalanche risk is everywhere, and that makes one of the many reasons it is such a dangerous mountain. 11 climbers left Camp 4 for the summit on the 13th of August. Allison left at 2 a.m. 5 of the climbers turned around before reaching the bottleneck couloir, a notorious section on the main summit route where climbers have to ascend beneath an enormous serac which could collapse at any moment. In the midst of these 5, there was a more cautious climber known as Peter Hillary. He's the son of Edmund Hillary, who is recognized to be the first man to climb Everest. Peter felt that it was much too cold and he didn't like the look of the weather, so he quickly decided to descend as far as he could and get away from the mountain for the moment. That decision he made proved to be a wise decision after all. And there was a system of warm, moist air. It was coming up from the valley from the south, where it was about to collide with a powerful anticyclone approaching from the northern Chinese side of the mountain. The storm met Peter at 5 p.m. while descending. He was descending beneath the Black Pyramid, a more technical section of loose cliffs, and suddenly he found himself fighting for his life in 80 to 100 mile-an-hour winds. Being that the storm caught them unawares, the victims were very much terrified, where they fought for their respective lives till they passed out. It was a disheartening scenario, especially for Allison, knowing she had a family. The climbers had gone mountaineering freely without the knowledge that something disastrous as death was about to befall them. I guess if they had known, they would have not risked it. Before her death, Alison Hargreaves, who was a noted British climber, and said 3 months before, "I don't think about death. I climb because I love mountains." And to honor her, her husband and 2 children traveled to the foot of K2. Hargreaves was known to be the first woman to climb Mount Everest alone and without oxygen. The Scotland native had once said, "It's better to have lived 1 day as a tiger than 1,000 as a sheep." So in all, a total number of 7 people died in the K2 disaster in 1995, and it was labeled the worst year since after that 1986. A lot of people are of the view that several external factors contributed to the tragedy, which included the lack of communication and coordination among the climbers, inadequate equipment and supplies, and the difficult and unpredictable weather conditions on K2. Despite the tragedy, many climbers continue to attempt to summit K2, drawn by the challenge and the allure of one of the world's most impressive parks. However, the 1995 disaster serves as a stark reminder of the dangers involved in high-altitude mountaineering and the need for proper planning, preparation, and caution. Today, climbers who attempt to summit K2 often use satellite phones and other advanced technologies to stay in communication and track weather conditions, and they typically carry a range of specialized equipment to help them navigate the mountain safely. One issue climbers faced during the expedition was the difficulty of the climbing itself. K2 is known for its steep, rocky terrain and unpredictable weather patterns, which can change rapidly with little warning. Climbers must be extremely skilled and experienced to navigate the mountain successfully. Another challenge was the sheer number of climbers attempting to summit K2 that year. The 1995 climbing season saw a large influx of climbers, many of whom were inexperienced and ill-equipped for the challenges of the mountain. This led to overcrowding of the mountain and further complications when the storm hit. The 1995 K2 disaster sparked a renewed focus on safety and high-altitude mountaineering. In the subsequent years after the unfortunate disaster, many climbers and mountaineering organizations began to prioritize safety over speed and competition, recognizing that the risks of climbing high-altitude peaks can be significant. Again, the disaster led to changes and improvements in the way mountaineering expeditions are organized and managed. Of recent, many expeditions are led by experienced guides who have a deep understanding of the mountain and the challenges that climbers will face. These guides often work with teams of climbers over weeks or months, carefully coordinating logistics and resources to ensure the safety and success of the expedition. The K2 climbing season in 1995 has proved to be a memorable one in the mountain's dubious history, recording the most number of deaths since the first two disasters occurred. But even at that, climbers enjoyed the sport of submitting at the mountain. So tell me, what would it have been like for you up there? Have you ever pictured yourself in that situation? What do you think about the K2 and the disaster of 1995? Share your thoughts with us in the comment section below, and don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel. Thanks for watching.